Most important question. What am I going to talk about? That's really the big question of your podcast. I get all the time. What should I talk about? Now, the answer is anything. Literally anything. You can do a podcast on Slinkies for all I care. I don't know how you would do it, but you could do it. Now, if you're a business, it's easy to talk about your business, your story, your mission. Like, Christian, you could do like a 5-episode podcast on just your business, Cube Recording Studios, all the services
Absolutely.
you do. So, like, how do you think you would plan that out?
How would I plan that out? I would plan it out. I would probably split it into 2 topics, the business side and then the audio and musical side of things. And I could explain, there could be how-tos, how to set up the process I do when a client calls the studio and I answer the phone. What do I say? Of course, I don't just wing it. I know I've done it enough times to know exactly what I'm going to say, what kind of questions I'm going to ask, how I'm going to qualify them based off their project, what their needs are, what their budget is, what their time frame is, and if all goes well, what next steps are. How do you get in here? What's the address? Are there files that need to be sent over? So there's a lot of different things I could talk about. And then once they get in, how do I set up? How do I pick a microphone for them if they're going to be singing? Things like this. After we record it, what's my process for recording? What do we do first? What do we do last? What order do you do things? There's a lot of different areas that I could attack it. Production. Do you need production? What's that process going to look like? That's going to look different from somebody who comes in and already has music.
Yeah.
But very all-encompassing about the business, and I guess the main topics would be the business side of things and logistics, and the music side of things. How do those things operate?
You could also interview your clients, right? You can use it as a way to get people in the door. So say you have a musician who wants to work with you, they're a little hesitant, you should be like, okay, how about this? Come to the studio, let's do a podcast. You and me, 101, we'll promote your music, right? We'll put your branding in there. See how this Cube Recording Studios is in this window? That's going to be your logo instead, or your album cover, or,
Right.
whatever you want to do in there.
Oh, okay. So that's what you mean. Not just an informative podcast, but any type of podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or a lot of times I do studio footage, or I'm in the process of building up a freestyle rap podcast where, artists from, different areas, they come to the studio and, they're just sitting at a table with a bunch of other people who have the same similar skill set and, going back and forth. Or like you said, interviewing artists. What's their story? How did they get to have the skills and, be wanting to pursue a music career?
It's networking. Right,
Yeah.
And that person could be like, he could come in, see a studio. You see how good of a job you do with it.
I could do one on audio engineering.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that are related to, the studio.
It tells the story of your business, your story, your mission, your expertise. It's a channel to get your voice out there. It's a way to get new business.
Talk about whatever, your topic, but I'm sure your topic is probably, it starts off ambiguous.
Yes.
And then just like tree branches, you're like, okay, well, I could talk about this thing. I could talk about this thing. I could talk about this thing. Or I could talk about all of them.
Yeah.
Or you could pick one.
That's a good way of looking at it. Start broad and get specific.
Yes.
But if you do have a business, right, your business doesn't need to be what your podcast is about, really.
Right. It doesn't have to be direct. Like I with the freestyle rap podcast. This isn't like 106 in Park Freestyle Friday. Like that's not what we do here, but it's an aspect that might be attractive and is somewhat related, but it's not direct. It's not like I'm getting on the podcast and be like, these are my services and this is what I do, call the number on the screen.
Right.
Way too direct.
It's just an ad. At this point, it's just an ad.
It's like you're selling me something. No, I'm just showing you something that is somewhat related. And if it turns into the goal isn't for me to generate business.
Right.
It's just to give you content.
Right.
Right.
But, if you have a business, like say you run a hardware store, right? And you sell, knives, hammers, nails, nail guns, duct tape, electric tape, whatever. But you love outdoors. You love nature. You love fishing. You could do a fishing podcast, right? Like, no, this lure is the best. It gets the best guppies, the fattest guppies. Let me tell you about this guppy, right? You could do a podcast on that, and you could run ads from your hardware store on that podcast, because fishing and hardware, it could be somewhat related. Doesn't even have to be related. Like, the best example I use is Conrad Thompson. I love talking about this guy. So if you're asking yourself, who is that? Not important. What Conrad does is he sells home mortgages. That is what he does. He is like a mortgage lender, whatever it's called. I don't know. I've never bought a mortgage, so I don't know. But he sells mortgages. But he's also a podcaster who talks about wrestling. And he has like 4 or 5 different wrestling podcasts over the past 7 or 8 years. He has managed to create multiple podcasts with some of the biggest names in wrestling. He did one with Ric Flair. He did one with Eric Bischoff. He does one with Tony Schiavone. He does one with Bruce Pritchard. He does one with Jeff Jarrett. He does one with Arn Anderson. And he might be done with another one, right? But my point is, he had that connection, right? He had that network. He just happened to know Ric Flair through radio. And he also married his daughter, so that was pretty cool. Ric Flair's the guy who goes, woo, on TV. But he did these podcasts, super entertaining, took off like wildfire, has a massive audience of millions of downloads over the past, tens of millions of downloads over the past years across all the podcasts. He runs ads on his mortgage business on that podcast and makes a killing. Absolute killing. And wrestling has absolutely nothing to do with his business. He also runs ads on a bunch of other things, and he makes them entertaining and engaging. But he is a businessman who has a podcast that has nothing to do with his business, but applies to the audience who listens to that podcast, like home mortgages. That's something that I can apply to. You can put a home mortgage ad on any kind of podcast because people will always be buying homes, at least hopefully. So pretty much, if you're trying to find a discussion topic, what do you like? What are you passionate about? Sports? Fitness? Religion? Movies and entertainment? TV and entertainment? Zodiac signs? You can talk about anything. And the analogy I use with Conrad is, it's kind of the inverse of a business podcast for a business. This kind of does the inverse of a business, meaning you are starting a podcast as a business. Your podcast can then turn into a business in it of itself. And whichever one you choose is totally fine. But first, decide what you want to talk about. Find your niche as well as your target audience. Another thing you might want to think about is, what does your audience want to hear? Or what might they want to hear? So let me use an analogy of a baseball podcast. That's very vague. That's very broad. You can do what Christian said and kind of cover all of them, all those branches. Or you can kind of think more niche, try to find the hole in the market. Are you going to...
It's always better to go niche.
It is, but podcasting, it is better to go niche. And then if you're kind of stuck, go a little more broad. Like if you want to have things to talk about, you can go more broad. So you could follow a specific team. You could follow the Phillies if you love the Phillies. Philly fans are freaking crazy, right? They'll listen to it. Or maybe that Christian like you're Puerto Rican, even though some people don't believe it, but you are.
Yeah, apparently I'm not Puerto Rican. I got to speak Spanish for them to know. You
could do profiles on Puerto Rican players. Or you could go with Latin American players, like Dominican players. Dominican players are all over the MLB, right? Like you could cover players from past and present, and like the Negro Leagues up until currently. Like prospects, he is like the biggest prospect coming from Puerto Rico or Dominican Republic. That's very niche. People would love that, especially internationally. Or you could cover the MLB as a whole. Excuse me. What kind of audience would that attract? What might they want to hear in addition to what you have to say? And if you find that audience, then you got to find advertisers to target towards that audience. And then once you have that topic, what I would do is go search on Spotify, go search on iTunes, go search on Google, and search that genre. The purpose of this is to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So if you find a popular podcast, listen to it. What do you think works for this podcast? Why is it popular? Again, with baseball, someone like John Boy Media, he is phenomenal because he does in-depth analysis of baseball. He takes a lot of time and a lot of effort in his videos as well as his regular podcast. So that's why that's successful. It's attention to detail. But do that and find out how you can be different. If it's a financial podcast covering news, the latest finance news, maybe you can switch it up. Talk about historic moments in the stock market. Find a hole in the market. Recently, at least as of recording this, we had the anniversary of the 2008 housing market crash, right? You could take a look at that day in history and see how it compares to the current housing market we have today. Or you could take a look at 1971 when we went off the gold standard and see what happened since we left the gold standard in the U.S. economics. So stuff like that. Find your niche. Find that hole in the market and plug it with your podcast.